The very first good book I wrote wasn't about Falco. It was called The Course of Honor. And 10 years after I started writing Falco, they agreed to publish it. But when I first did it, there was huge prejudice against historical novels as a whole. This is almost inconceivable now. If you go into a bookshop or go online, you cannot believe there was a time when publishers thought historical novels weren't wanted, but that applied. The Romans were thought too difficult. And then I set out in my first really good book, I'm convinced it's almost the best book I've ever written, to write the love story of the Emperor Vespasian. And I have to admit, when I started, I had never heard of him myself. So it's fair to say you could not expect the public to know very much about him. He was the man who built the Colosseum. I'd not been to Rome, so I only vaguely knew about even the Colosseum. And he had a really interesting private life in that, first of all, he was influenced by his grandmother and his mother, whereas all the textbooks will tell you it was a very patriarchal society, but not in their household, where I think I could have fitted in quite well. And then he fell for a freed slave. She was fairly well educated, obviously, because she worked as a secretary for the mother of the Emperor Claudius, who we had heard of because of I, Claudius being on the telly, not so much from reading it. But so there's this woman he really takes for in his youth, but he can't marry her because she's a freed slave, and Roman law didn't allow you to be a senator, which he wanted to be, or his mother wanted him to be one. And his mother prevailed, which in itself is interesting when you think about the way people tend to view the Romans. So they part. And if you're a romantic novelist, that's wonderful, because first you have love, then you have sobbing and parting. And a long while afterwards, when he had been married in a way that was more approved of, his wife died and he went back to her. So it's more sobbing and, oh, it's all right. And then a long time after that, he stands to be emperor, and emperors weren't supposed to have concubines, but he still couldn't marry this girl, Antonia Caenis. So everybody thought he'll have to leave her because his platform is traditional family values, but he didn't. It's just, it's a story you couldn't make up convincingly, but there it is. And I couldn't believe nobody had written about it, but nobody had. I did, and nobody wanted to publish it because it was too difficult, and the Romans and all of that. So to go back to your question of 10 minutes ago, out of that came Falco. I used the research that I'd done into the time of Vespasian and the city that he and Antonia Caenis lived in. And it struck me that it was like the big metropolitan cities that are the background for the Philip Marlowe type of gumshoe and every kind of routine detective who has his own city. Almost every city in England has got a novelist writing a series of detective novels set there. It was a huge, colourful city, and it was a city full of people on the make. They didn't have detectives as we know them, but they did have characters they called delatores. We usually translate that as informers. They were really kind of ambulance chasing lawyers who would go after rich people and prosecute them, possibly for crimes they had not even committed, so that if they were found guilty, which they generally were, their estates would be confiscated, and the informer would get a chunk of it, but the emperor would get much more, and bad emperors would encourage this to happen. So that was the genesis of Falco as a career man. It's something that society pretended to despise, but could be lucrative if you were lucky. Now his name, he had to have 3 names because he's a free Roman citizen. And I was very scientific about it, actually, Jake. First of all, there weren't many Roman first names. They say 12. There were possibly a few more. But I worked through them, and I chose Marcus because it's also a modern name. And I thought that would make it slightly more recognizable to people, although it was also Roman. And then I wanted to give him a final name that was a tool like Sam Spade or Mike Hammer. So I literally, this is pathetic really, I got a Latin dictionary, and in bed at night, I went through it from alpha to omega, looking up words, because I'd done Latin, but I couldn't remember tool names. And the only thing that leapt out at me as suitable was falx, which means a sickle. And he was originally called Falx, but it didn't roll off the tongue or the page. So that turned itself into Falco. And then I thought, in retrospect, I must admit, well, that could be an allusion to the Maltese falcon. I could pretend I'd done that deliberately. Then he needed a family name. While looking through this dictionary, pathetically, I came across Didius, and it said a plebeian surname. So I wanted him to be a plebeian because that was my own background, and I thought it would work better. So he got Didius. Then he's Marcus Didius Falco, and that, if you look at it the way my parents looked at names for their children, actually, and look at the initials, it's MDF, which I don't know if you have the same, but we were having a lot of do-it-yourself programs, and they were always carving up medium density fiberboard. So I like that. You're beginning to see the weird way my brain works. The word crafting didn't really come into it, Jake, to be honest. You had to think, I'm a nicely brought up young lady from the Midlands. I'd never seen a dead body. I'd never had anything to do with the police. I hadn't ever really intended to be a crime writer as such. I was going to do romances. So I had no idea at all. And the very first one, I set off, I knew who he was. Falco sprang into my consciousness, fully formed, really. And so he starts having an adventure, and I had decided that to persuade publishers they could do the Romans after all, he had to come to Roman Britain. Horrible though that was, and it didn't really suit him as a metropolitan detective anyway. But for that, I had discovered a genuine archaeological bit of plot, which is that some silver ingots that had clearly been stolen by somebody had been discovered buried under a cairn in the West Country. What didn't strike me immediately was that if they were found in the 20th century, then they'd have to stay under that cairn. Falco could not investigate them and take them away. So in the end, he puts them there and is too badly wounded because of the adventures he's had that he can't go back and collect them. So that was my first lesson in not actually using real archaeology, because it doesn't work. It was a combination of things, really. There came a year when my partner died, my editor moved to a new publishing house, my agent was getting to be a poor old lady, and I had written 20 Falco novels. And who does a job where they work 20 years in the same branch, really? And they never moved to accounts or transportation or something else different. I wanted a change. When I moved publisher, they wanted more Falco, but I'd had enough, Jake. There comes a time when you've said all that you've got to say. So what next? And I grumpily conceded that I would write more Roman detective stories if I could be allowed to have a different main protagonist, and if it could be a woman. And so Flavia Alba came into being, who had been just a background character previously. It was deliberate that I chose her. I did consider other characters from the series who could have done it, but she had everything, starting with the fact she's an outsider. She's been brought from Britain. So all the Roman stuff that I'd been writing about, I can write about it again, but it's from a completely different standpoint. Falco decries Rome and its traditions, but he is at heart a Roman. Alba comes in and she's educated to know what Rome is and what everything stands for, but she's also seeing it through a foreigner's eyes, and she's able to say, they're balmy, these Romans, when it's appropriate for her to do so. She's a woman, so it's a completely different look at it. She has a different outlook from him in many ways, but she's clever and she's brave and talented, and he's trained her. So we leap over 12 years, so she's grown up, because there was no way I was going to write about a 14 or 17-year-old. She's bitter in the way that every detective has to be. She's had bad things in her past, but there she is doing the job in a darker period, because by then we've left Vespasian and the golden age behind, and we've got this paranoid emperor that I knew all about because I'd written a novel about him. So it was the same and yet subtly different, and I think refreshed me a lot. Desperate Undertakings is about the Roman popular theatre. I suspect there were many other kinds of theatre, but we know that horrible things happened on the Roman stage, things that people literally died or were raped or fell from above and were crushed. And I decided that I would do a really gruesome book. It's not my nature, obviously. I'm lovely and I wouldn't dream of it otherwise, but it seemed like a really good idea. And I would use every example I could find from history of things that genuinely happened on the Roman stage that make us go, oh, they're not the same as us, are they? And I would set each one in one of the grand venues that I had not explored very much. Domitian's Stadium and Odeum, for example, which I hadn't covered. They didn't exist in the Falco series. And so my own personal love of theatre came into it. And there are people, unexpected characters, stand about discussing Greek theatre. That's a good joke, but also allows me to play with my love of the history of theatre. And then I think my favourite thing that happens is to do with Oedipus Rex, which many people have not realised is in fact a road rage story. It starts with him killing his father, and the description of what happens at that crossroad is like every incident of road rage that we have in the modern world. It's just a wonderful comparison. I had this idea that we are often in bars. Bars are very useful places for crime novelists because you can have people can be killed there, or people can meet there and interview witnesses or suspects, or they can just go and get drunk when the case isn't going terribly well. And so Falco's family, now Alba's family, they own a bar. And I had this idea of somebody not paying their bill, and her aunt insists that Alba has got to track them down. And that would be the seed point for an enormously complicated story. It's so complicated, I actually advise people not to try and follow it, just to let it wash over them. They do like it, but I have never written one of those puzzle books as such. I have no patience with them myself. I want them to just enjoy the scenes that happen. And then when they come to the end, I hope they can see that there were clues to everything that is solved, more or less on the last page, actually. The joke in that story is that there isn't a body for a very long time. We don't know who's been murdered, if anybody has been murdered. And towards the end, we find out that somebody was, but it's not as we thought. And then on the very last page, somebody else is murdered. And it does all fit together. I have readers who go back and read my stories again and again. And so they will, on their rereading, be picking up things they missed on the first time. A Death on the Tibre came to me because I'd always wanted to write a book that had to do with the river. I've used it to some extent, and somebody at the very beginning is found drowned in the river. So that is a normal sort of crime mystery starting point. We have to find out who she is, how she came to be there. It was obviously foul play. So that leads into one of my normally complicated stories. It's also about gang warfare because she had an association with a gangster. It's about also the past because it connects with Albia's own horrible past in Britain, and Albia having to make a decision about whether she's going to let her past govern her future. I'm not going to tell you what she decides to do, though people can guess if they want to. I've never really been very good about knowing what people look like. And I think it goes back to what I said to you at the beginning, that I grew up with the radio, where you hear voices and the voices are what matter to me. I think I hear her speaking a fairly well-educated sort of voice. She doesn't have a profound British accent because that would get in the way, really. But I write in the first person, both for Falco and for Albia, and so they are speaking.